of the Technological Leadership Institute, and I would like to welcome all of you to our Technically Speaking event today. The topic of this event is diversity, equity, and inclusion in technological leadership. If we can go to the next slide. So here's the rough agenda. I'm going to be speaking very briefly about TLI, and then we're going to turn it over to Kirk Froggatt, who is our recently retired Gemini chair, and the winner of the Froggatt Fellowship will be announced. It's very exciting. And then we're going to have a panel that is going to speak on diversity, equity, and inclusion in technological leadership. And we're very, very pleased with the esteemed representatives that we have today. And then we'll have some closing remarks. So if we can go to the next slide. So TLI develops leaders in technology. And one of the reasons why we are having this panel today is an element in that leadership training has to be an understanding and the ability to implement diversity, equity, and inclusion plans. So there are a variety of programs at TLI, including a management of technology program, medical device innovation, and security technology. And this institute was developed in 1987 with a endowment from the Honeywell Foundation. And if we can go to the next slide. We're really trying to transform TLI in the near future, and we're calling it TLI 2.0. That involves strengthening our core master's programs, expanding outreach to academic departments in the College of Science and Engineering, fostering innovation and entrepreneurship, and creating custom programs for reskilling and upskilling technical professionals. So if we can go to the next slide. So there's two new initiatives I'm not going to spend much time talking about, but Mark Sanders, the newly inaugurated Gemini chair, is creating what he has called Minnovation, and that is a series of entrepreneurial resources that will help foster innovation in the College of Science and Engineering and across the university more broadly. TLI has also become home for the Center for Medical Device Cybersecurity. Bill Eretz is the managing director, and this is a joint industry academic consortium, and we're very excited that we are playing a leadership role in this endeavor. So if we can go to the next slide. So as the Froggatt Fellowship and the panel here are an element within TLI 2.0 in what we are describing as reducing barriers to participation. So our hope would be that the increased and enhanced scholarship and fellowship support that we are working on raising right now will help reduce barriers of financial barriers to participation. We are also hoping that this panel will continue and foster our efforts at enhancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and that more specifically, the Froggatt Fellowship will help reduce both financial barriers to participation and foster diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if we can go to the next slide. So I'm going to turn things over to our esteemed colleague, Kirk Froggatt, who is going to be giving out this scholarship.
Thank you, Allison. You know, it's an honor to be able to give out this scholarship and to have it in my name. But I am really wanting to recognize TLI for creating this scholarship, and specifically Professor Tariq Samad for his role in initiating the scholarship year, the fellowship. I think it's a really wonderful thing, and I'm very excited about it. And before I introduce our first recipient, which is a very exciting announcement, I thought I would just share a story about one of the most defining chapters in my life around diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, I grew up in the upper Midwest in the very rural farm environment in Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So there was virtually no diversity to speak of. Fortunately, I was able to get off to college and graduate school where I started meeting folks from all over the world with very different backgrounds and cultures. And it was really exciting for me. I just was very, very interested in differences and different cultures. But it was when I joined companies in Silicon Valley. I spent the first 20 years of my career in Silicon Valley and worked for global tech companies. And the one that really was the defining chapter was the decade I spent at Silicon Graphics. And that was in the 1990s, so a long time ago. But what was powerful about it was that I had the great fortune to work with two incredible mentors. The first was the best boss I've ever had, who I reported to for 6 years in his role as senior vice president. And he just happened to be an African American who had incredible lived experience in growing up in the 60s with all of the challenges of being different. And yet he persevered and became an incredibly successful executive. And one of the first things he did after promoting me to vice president was helped me hire the most amazing diversity and inclusion professional I've ever known. Her name is Deb Daggett, and she came on board as our director of diversity and inclusion. And between the two of them, I learned so much during that decade about the power and importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So here's just a couple of quick lessons from my experience before we learn a lot more from the great panel that we've got tonight. You know, we all know diversity is the mix. And especially in STEM, achieving a diverse mix can be a really tough thing to do, especially back in the 1990s. But one of the best practices that Ken introduced for all of us was that he required that every manager in his organization did at least one exploratory interview with potential candidates every month. And the purpose of these required exploratory interviews were twofold. First, so that we were constantly learning and connecting to talent and building a more diverse talent pool so that when we did have an approved budgeted position, we weren't scrambling to find the first person that really fit the mold, which tended to be another one just like us. But secondarily, when we did find a really great diverse candidate and got very excited about it, but we didn't have a budgeted position, Ken held aside a separate budget at his level, and he would actually fund the hire right then and there with incremental money. And I'm telling you, that was an amazing incentive for managers to get out and find diverse talent and to really get those diverse hires on board. That dramatically accelerated the diversity of our mix. But then once we had the diverse mix, inclusion was about making the mix work more effectively. How do we create more inclusion and engagement for now a more diverse employee base? Deb was absolutely masterful in this regard. And I'll never forget the way she defined inclusion way back in the day. She defined inclusion as creating an environment where everyone feels safe to ask for what they need to be successful. So let's just unpack that a little bit. It ends with successful. The end game of all diversity, equity, inclusion work is success, win-win success. Win for the individual, individuals successfully doing their best work, and the company serving customers and growing the business. So that's the end game that matters to everyone. The front end of that is about creating safety to ask for what you need to be successful, because in a diverse world, we're all different. We bring different strengths, different gaps, and different needs to the party, different preferences to the party. And so we have to get more empathetic, compassionate, and interested in figuring out how to set up every individual for success in a one-size-fits-one way. So what Deb helped us do is then learn that diversity and inclusion are not separate from, but an integral part of. That diversity and inclusion had to be embedded in everything we did. So we took our hiring, training, promotion, and rewards practices and embedded the expectations of diversity, equity, inclusion in them. So that over a period of several years, we were reinforcing with surround sound the expectations for all managers to be the owners and the curators and the empowerers of a diverse team of people where everyone could feel included. And then finally, equity is about providing fair access and opportunity for everyone. And one of the things Ken, Deb, and I decided to do was develop an annual talent process, a talent audit process, where we reviewed all of our hiring, our training, our promotion, and our rewards practices, and how we were doing with our underrepresented colleagues versus our white male colleagues. And what gets measured gets managed. And by holding ourselves accountable, we could see where we were doing well and we could see where we were not. And it really helped inform with real data where we needed to put our priorities next. And so I think the culmination of figuring out how to put diversity, equity, and inclusion into practice for me is that you create an environment where everyone feels they belong. Belonging. I love the new diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging phrase, because when we belong, we feel valued, challenged, and capable of making a meaningful difference. And that is what inspires more discretionary effort, more personal risk-taking, and more commitment through the good times and the bad. That's where individuals succeed and where we collectively power through for customers to succeed in our organizations. And so it was just an incredibly valuable experience for me and has shaped me for the rest of my career. And I was fortunate to have that early on. I really look forward to hearing the other good best practices that our panelists are going to be sharing with us today as well, because this is an area where we always need to learn and grow. But first, before we go to the panel, I am absolutely delighted to announce the first recipient of TLI's new Diversity and Equity Fellowship. You know, we had several very strong applicants this year, which was terrific, but there was one that stood out for several reasons. First, this winner is someone who has significant lived experience as a woman, a person of color, a Muslim, and a working mom in a STEM discipline. She's experienced both the challenge and the opportunity of being the only one in many rooms over her career. Second, she is actively engaged in supporting and empowering other underrepresented colleagues in her workplace, which is terrific. And third, she had some very interesting ideas for TLI about how we might improve on our own diversity, equity, inclusion for students, faculty, and staff here at the Institute. So a great candidate. With this drum roll, I'm now delighted to introduce to you our first winner, Ambreen Athar. Now, Ambreen is currently a first-year student in the Master of Science in Management of Technology program, but she brings a tremendous background to the program. She has a Bachelor of Science in immunology and microbiology. She already has a Master of Science in Regulatory Affairs, and she's got almost 20 years of experience in med tech in regulatory and clinical affairs. So tremendous background, tremendous commitment to DEI, and tremendous lived experience. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ambreen.
Thank you, Professor Froggatt. Thank you to the Technology Leadership Institute and the Fellowship Selection Committee. I am honored to be recognized with this award and even more delighted that TLI is putting forth efforts towards diversity, equity, and inclusion by creating this fellowship. I'd like to briefly share some of my personal background and what triggered my interest in participating and supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. My parents moved to Canada as immigrants from the country of Pakistan. My mother also lived in Lebanon and my father in India. I was born and raised in Canada and have been in the US for 21 years now. I am married to a very patient man, and we have 3 children. When my parents immigrated from Pakistan, their goals were not only to find success and opportunity, but also to contribute in every way they could. Their mindset was to bring the best version of themselves to their careers and to their community. They taught me to appreciate the differences of cultures and to be aware that we can always learn from others. Being raised in an open-minded family is a gift that I am grateful for every day. One of the effects of being a child to immigrants is that we are sometimes considered the bridge or buffer generation. In a sense, we are able to see the nuances of different cultures through a unique lens and can relate to and see the intent behind both of them. I've unconsciously been using my experience as a bridger my entire life. It manifests itself as sympathy, empathy, and compassion. I use it in the workplace, in the classroom, and in social settings. Although it can be sometimes challenging, I recognize it is one of my greatest strengths. It ultimately leads me to foster an inclusive environment and pushes me to go that extra mile for someone else. As we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the field of technology and leadership, I am optimistic that our industries will be among the leaders to focus on this topic. We are, after all, the people who are at the forefront of change. We know change can lead to better things, and that change can impact so many in meaningful ways. When we place value on the convergence of technology, how can we not acknowledge the potential impact that diversity, equity, and inclusion could also bring to our converging fields? The pace of technology advancement is accelerating so quickly and will demand a group of leaders who recognize the global nature of the work we do, the value of making meaningful change, and the potential for growth that we have in not only the technology itself, but in those human beings who design, create, and deliver it. With that, I'd like to say thank you for this chance to participate and contribute to the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts for the Technology Leadership Institute. I am beyond excited to help their organization succeed in this work. Thank you very much for this opportunity and the fellowship.
Thank you so much, Amreen. Some of you, I learned something. This is, by the way, I'm Tariq Samad, and I'll move on to the next slide in our deck here. And I lead the Management of Technology program at the Technological Leadership Institute. And I was with Amreen in class actually just this weekend. And one other thing I found out about Amreen is that she's a huge Timberwolves fan as well. So multi-talented, and she played varsity ball too. So to move on now, we're going to get into the heart of the session here and into our panel session. Before we get started with that, there are a couple of housekeeping items I want to inform you about. So as you already know, the session is being recorded, and a version of this recording will be available on the TLI website pretty soon after the event. And it's actually something that I'm thinking we will be using for our programs down the road, because I'm just so excited about the caliber of people we have on the panel and even the remarks we've had so far, in fact. You will notice that you have both a Q&A button and a chat button at the bottom of your screen. If you have specific questions, and we really encourage specific questions for our panel to ask, please use the Q&A button for that. These questions will be visible to the panelists, and it'll be one place where we can all be checking to see if there are questions so that we can address them live, and we'll try and address as many of them live, of course, as we can. You also have the chat button available, and you can think of that as a way to get conversations going, interject thoughts you may have, and we'll be monitoring those as well, and could help us build on top of that, and the whole group could be building on top of those too. After the panel discussion and the Q&A associated with that concludes, I will come back with some final follow-up items. So please stay tuned for that. And with that, I am going to just hand it over pretty soon to our panel. And I just want you to see their names and their affiliations. It's such an awesome pool of people we have convened for this. I'm just so excited and proud to be able to have gathered such a group of talented folks in this space. So Roz Sai will be the moderator of the panel. Roz is Vice President of Talent Management at Thrivent. Before that, she was at Ecolab in a similar position as well. She's also worked at Honeywell. She has a PhD from the University of Minnesota in education and administration. She's taught at the University of Minnesota as well as at St. Thomas. So just a great person to have coordinating this whole effort. And I'm sure you'll be impressed with her as I've been in the preparatory meetings we've had. We also have Kelly Baker, who's the Chief Human Resources Officer at Thrivent. Shari Rosso, a former Vice President of Talent Acquisition at Best Buy. Miguel Rocha, who's the DEI Manager at Mortenson Construction. And Virajita Singh, Associate Vice Provost, Office for Equity and Diversity, University of Minnesota. So help me welcome the panel, and I will hand it over now to Roz, and we'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Tariq, and good evening, everyone. It is absolutely a personal delight and honor for me to participate in today's event, and my warmest welcome to our distinguished panelists. I'm just really honored to be in your presence on this very important topic. Before we dive into just brief introductions of our panelists, let me just offer a personal remark about Kirk Froggatt, who was a mentor when he and I worked together at Ecolab, an amazing colleague, and has continued to be a tremendous mentor to myself in the talent management space and so many of my colleagues. So it's a great opportunity for all of us to honor Kirk's impact and lasting legacy. So as we talk about this important topic today, the business case, as well as the personal and ethical, moral cases around diversity, equity, and inclusion is compelling. This is an important issue, particularly in today's environment, in light of the Great Resignation during this prolonged pandemic, as organizations seek to attract and retain top talent. This is an important topic for me personally, as a talent leader in a Fortune 500 organization. And it's a very personal topic as well as an immigrant and an Asian woman leader in a wide range of industries in my own career path. So with me today are distinguished leaders in our community, beginning with Sherry Russell, who has worked in retail for 34 years, 24 of which she worked for a large Minnesota-based consumer electronics retailer, where she held many executive positions. And her last role in that organization, she led enterprise talent acquisition, which allowed her to really influence the organization to build teams where not all of its members look and think the same. And it's a foundational belief that she brings to her work and in her mission around creating a sense of belonging and inclusion for all who join the organization. Second, we have Professor Rajata Singh. She's the Associate Vice Provost for the Office of Equity and Diversity at the University of Minnesota, where her work focuses on institutional equity, and she leads numerous initiatives that involve tremendous number of partners and organizations to drive community impact. Professor Singh is a designer, educator, researcher, and an artist engaging principles of deep creativity, innovation, and partnership to catalyze and empower individuals and communities towards cultural transformation within and beyond the academic environment. All right, also with us is Miguel Rocha, who's actually finishing his career in 3M as the Diversity and Inclusion Global Lead. He is now going to start at Mortensen Construction as the DEI manager. And Miguel's role not only represents his tremendous professional engagement in the important work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, he has also been deeply engaged across many organizations in our community, such as being board of directors for CLUES, HBCU Make It, MSP engagement team, as well as organizations such as National Association of Asian American Professionals, Breakthrough Twin Cities, and so on and so forth. The energy that Miguel brings to this work is truly inspiring. Last but not least, Kelly Baker is the EVP and Chief HR Officer at Thrivent, which is a diversified financial services organization that helps people achieve financial clarity, enabling lives full of meaning and gratitude for our over 2 million clients. I am delighted personally to welcome Kelly Baker, as she is my leader in our collective work at Thrivent. But Kelly brings over 25 years of experience leading HR function. She spent 20 of those years at General Mills in a variety of HR leadership roles. Prior to her joining Thrivent, she was the Chief HR Officer at Patterson Companies, as well as at Pentair. So in addition to her professional experience, Kelly also serves on the board of Minnesota Children's Theater, where she leads Diversity, Inclusion, and Human Capital Committee. She's also recently named a non-executive director at Ferguson. Kelly holds a bachelor's degree in business administration from Howard University and the master's in business administration from the University of Michigan. So as you can tell, we have assembled a very distinguished and deeply experienced group of leaders in our community together as we celebrate the inaugural award of the Kirk Froggett Diversity and Inclusion Fellowship, as well as inspiring all of us on this call and beyond to take action to drive progress in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So welcome, everyone. All right, to get our conversation started, by the way, let me reiterate Tariq's recommendation to all of the participants on this call. Feel free to chat, use the chat feature throughout our conversations. If you have suggestions, comments, questions, feel free. And then also use the Q&A feature so that we can monitor the questions as they come in. So to kick us off, let me begin with Kelly and followed by Professor Virajita, please. First question, simply to kind of get us all grounded on the topics that we're talking about here on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if I may invite you to just chime in with your perspective around what do we mean when we say diversity and equity? Kelly, may I begin with you?
Yeah, absolutely. This is, hopefully you can hear me okay. I just like to make it really simple, and I'll use an analogy that many of you may have heard before, but it always helps me help others kind of think through what do we mean, because by diversity, equity, inclusion, right, where we've been, in particularly this concept of equity, certainly in corporations, has really elevated in prominence. And so I love the analogy of the dance, and many of you have heard this before, where diversity is where everyone is invited to the dance, right? No matter who you are, your background, et cetera, you're invited to come to the dance, you're invited to come to the party. Inclusion is about actually being asked to contribute to the playlist of the party, right? So what is what's your taste in music? We want to celebrate that. And equity means that everyone has access to the dance floor. They have an ability to dance. That's how I really like to just very simply think about what are the differences. And, I'll go just a step further that, one without the other actually, in my experience, doesn't drive as much progress. All three working together and a consciousness of all three working together is actually what drives progress. To have a lot of diversity is awesome, but when you don't have an environment where that diversity feels like they can thrive and contribute and have opportunity, you're just creating a revolving door. To have lots of diversity, but really not think through what do we need to help deliver to people in order for them to grow and excel for themselves, right? Not the peanut butter approach. That doesn't help you either. And so I do think all three of the concepts work really are essential to making progress.
Mm-hmm.
And if I might add to that, that was an excellent example, Kelly. It really embodies, all of those different terms that can be so opaque to a lot of people. But what I might focus on is sort of diversity itself, right? So, for example, at the University of Minnesota, we have a very broad definition of diversity, where we talk about American Indian and other indigenous populations, people of color, including other underrepresented groups, immigrant populations, people with both apparent and non-apparent disabilities, people who identify as women, people of various gender and sexual identities and expressions, and first-generation students. And then on top of that, we also say that we care about diversity in the context of individuals who might encounter barriers based on their religious expression, age, national origin, ethnicity, and so on. And we recognize the intersectionality that people may claim one or more of these identities. And so I guess I wanted to bring that up to also say that maybe 20 years ago, that wasn't necessarily the definition as it was articulated. So to recognize that these definitions of what diversity is constantly evolving, and to open our minds to that evolution. And going back to what Kelly said, inclusion is really that all of these differences, people with all of these differences can thrive in the context and environment.
Yeah, and the thing I would often reflect on, and thank you for these really important explanations and very personalized analogies. The thing that I often reflect on is as much as we kind of make these broad aspirational statements, underneath that is every single one of us brings profound personal experiences where we all live through moments when our best gifts were we had no chance to actually bring it to bear, and we all lived moments when we were called upon to be able to contribute and really make a meaningful difference. So I'd love to hear from our other panelists where I invite you to reflect on why is this so important to you personally.
I'm more than,
go ahead.
you go, Sherry, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I would just say, being invited in is one thing. And there was a person, probably all of us can picture a person, whether it's a parent, a guardian, a friend, somebody we didn't want to be like. I think there's a lot to be learned from, oh, and please, if I ever do that, if I ever step into it like that, knock me on the head. There's experiences that I've had that I'm sure we can all think of where, that person opened a door for me. What I chose to bring into that room with myself, it is partly on me, but it's also the environment and what's going to be allowed in the room. And so having that opportunity to really, and I'm sure you're going to, I love this so much because we're probably all like, yes, and that, and oh, I would have said that too. But providing opportunity to at least be given a seat. I think of a table, Kelly thinks of a dance. We probably all have our own picture of what it is. And, I said, if diversity is having me at the table, inclusion is creating a safe space for me to actually have an opinion and the psychological safety to not feel like I can't say exactly what's on my mind.
Right.
And I've had that, I've had such great mentors, I'm sure we all have, but I've also had those ones that I don't want to be like, that I think you learn just as much from.
Yep.
And just to jump in, I love all the examples. I think that for me, I don't know, I'm a fighter. It's in my blood. It's something that that I've lived through, that I've experienced, that's in my family's history. My grandfather jumped and unboarded an unoccupied rail car when he was 12 from Mexico, went to St. Paul. And from there, my grandmother, she fought for immigrant rights. From there, she developed a relationship, I should say more of a friendship, with Cesar Chavez. My mom, when she was a junior in high school, when you go in junior year and you want to say to the counselor, like, this is what I want to do when I grow up. Her high school guidance counselor said, Maria, Mexicans don't go to college. And so those experiences really led to what I'm doing today. Even my mother at the University of Minnesota, she fought for the Department of Chicano Studies. She marched Morrill Hall. And so those are just opportunities that I have learned. And even with my grandparents and mother, and believing that an education is important, I wouldn't be here today. And with the fight that they had in them, their relentless pursuit of working nonstop, discrimination, it was something that really affected my family. But it's especially in Minnesota, but it's something that they move forward with. So this is something very personal to me. So I take it personally. And people say don't take business personally, but I do. And that's the way I lead.
That's a powerful, powerful story. And if you think about, a junior high schooler being told, there's the end of your journey, when, so much of her impact is yet to be felt. And I think so many of us have experienced moments when we were made to feel smaller, and all of us are in situations when we can help others unleash what they have to bring to the table. So And I'm
It's-
watching Embreen commenting about love the warrior examples in your family. That's fantastic.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
and I
Kelly.
forgot to mention one thing is that my mother, she ended up actually getting her master's, and she became the first elementary Hispanic principal in the state of Minnesota.
Bravo. All
All
right.
Forgot to mention that part.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. Hey, Roz, I did want to piggyback on something you were saying. I'm so inspired by what I'm hearing from everyone, and bravo to your mom, Miguel. But this idea of all of us, I'm sure all of us, kind of whether we're
Right.
women, people of color, whatever, have experienced something, right, where we've been felt to not feel that included.
Mhm.
And then we all have an opportunity to help. And I was thinking about as I was thinking about a personal example, I've got relatively recent. I was still a pretty senior person, but I was one of 2 women on the executive team. And what I found out early on is that one, we were 2 women, relatively new to the organization, didn't have a ton of the industry experience. We were on a team with majority men that did. And what I found consistently is that these men had lots of points of connection, not just their maleness, but their experience base, what they've seen. There were a lot of points of connection that created a dynamic where, I would say microaggressions were sprinkled all around, completely unintentional, but sprinkled all around. And what almost instinctively I found is that me and the other woman on the executive team, I found us saying, in meetings, right, where maybe they just glossed over a comment that I might make, or glossed over, or just kind of ignored a comment she might make, or kind of took over the room.
Mhm.
What I found is very naturally and instinctively, one of us always saying, well, to such and such, to Sally's point, X, Y, Z, or as Sally just explained, oh yeah. And we didn't know we were doing it until we like a few months later, we kind of started talking about it, and we're like, oh, we actually are doing that. It was really instinctual, but it was so helpful because the thing that was so amazing about it is that it set an example for everybody else on our team. And then you started to see how others, well, the rest of the team, they were white men, but came from very different backgrounds. And so you saw there was, one person, one particular expertise, never felt like he was able to get a strategic thought in the mix.
Right.
Well, as we started role modeling that, what we started to see is him chiming in and then others chiming in. And it was an awesome experience for me to reflect on, where we weren't really strategic about how we went about it, but to see how by just stepping up and actually in our cases, instinctually lifting up another woman on the team, set an example for the broader team on how we bring other voices to the table and how important it is to bring other voices to the table.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that is such a powerful example of, maybe there was no diversity and inclusion training per se, but, you instinctively reached out to understand that there is power in amplifying each other's voices.
Mhm.
And that's something that we can all do within the day-to-day operations of today, right? Whether we're in the building or whether we're on, team calls with each other, what are some of the specific things that we can all lean in and begin with where we can make a difference? So I'm going to flip the process a little bit here and get our panelists to weigh in on that exact point that Kelly just shared, which is rather than waiting for others to make the conditions a little more ideal for ourselves, what are some of the things, whether it's instinctive or some things that you've observed others who have done, that literally we as individuals can each take ownership of action. We can each lean in and help amplify each other and allow the diverse voices to be heard. So, I mentioned, I think Tariq mentioned as well, that I spent quite a few years at Ecolab, and there are many, many very inspirational leaders in the entire, very successful history of that wonderful global company. And I remember one of the really respected leaders there had a mantra. In fact, he had a coin made that a lot of folks at Ecolab still carry that coin after many, many years. And he said, if it's going to be, it's up to me. And, and as I listen to Kelly's story, I'm inspired by that mantra that we don't have to wait for others to make that happen. So for all of the panelists, I'd love to invite you, maybe Sherry, I could ask you to share your thoughts around what can we each as individuals do to just own our sphere of influence and start making diversity, equity, and inclusion part of the environment wherever we might sit.
Yeah, I absolutely love it. And it's so funny. I almost took a picture of my paper. It says, if it is to be, it starts with me. It's crazy how, you know, obviously if you have conversations like this, a lot of it sounds very similar.
Yes.
But, you know, taking personal responsibility and starting with yourself, because I also think that, you know, I was just reading, I don't know if any of you have had an opportunity yet. I love Will Smith. I've been listening to his new book, and I have to tell you, you know, I ain't getting paid by Will Smith, but I'll tell you that book is amazing. And he talks about in the very beginning about his father and asking him and his brother to build a wall. And when he started to look at the wall as one brick at a time, that's how I go into it. And so I think that there's so much that we can do, and I'll get tactical with you, like from a hiring perspective, take a look at your job descriptions. I guarantee you your job descriptions are he, she. I guarantee that there are words in there like must be a ninja at XYZ. There are things written in job descriptions that are so archaic, it would make you crazy. But if you look at that whole thing at once, there are thousands and thousands and thousands. Think about the University of Minnesota. How many job descriptions do you have that need to be rewritten? Start with one, start with two. Take a look at the language. When you're posting positions, are you inviting everyone to apply for those jobs? Are you inadvertently leaving people out? A lot of times we talk about we're going to hire the unicorn. We need the unicorn, the person that's got these just super unique skills. No. Like, are you growing talent? Do you have an internship program? Are you lined up with HBCUs? Do you have representation? Is it a passion of someone's? I also feel very strongly that you can't just tap a leader on the shoulder and say, you're in charge of HBCUs. No. Like, are you passionate about it? Do you know people? Are you connected? Kelly went to Howard. Have you talked to Kelly? Like, I think that there's so much we can do that just starts with one little thing at a time. You know, you say, you know, we said, if it is to be, it starts with me. I would also say, if you see something, say something. You know, if you're in a room and you're the one of two women in there, like, it's okay to look to the other female and say, we got this. Like, we're going to lean in and we're going to make a change today. If there's power in voice, that's okay to exploit your own. So I guess that's what I would say to that. I could just talk about this forever, by the way. So
I love the fact that you have so much connection there, Sherry, because as you say, we could talk about this for a long time, because clearly you've been observing it, reflecting it, and practicing it. And I'm taking away some specific things for our audience, you know, now and, you know, future listening audience, that it doesn't need to be like change the entire universe of challenges. Begin with one job description. You know, thinking about changing many job descriptions is daunting, but you could change one. And you can change one conversation around, do we have anyone who needs this challenge, rather than waiting for a purple unicorn to appear in the candidate pool. Really challenge the opportunity to say, do we have someone who's ready for a developmental opportunity? And to really be intentional around how we show up in our words and in our actions. Because, you know, I spent 10 years earlier in my career in the high-tech industry, where we took a lot of pride in writing our job descriptions and our, you know, postings around dominate and, you know, overcome, and, you know, we play hard and work hard, and not being sensitive to understanding how would people embrace that, and how would people think, oh boy, what do they, you know, is that going to make it possible for me to play there? So such very practical ideas there. Miguel, are you leaning in with additional ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that
Reading your
there's so
body
many
language.
ideas to really, you know, when you think about increasing diversity by itself, that doesn't really mean that you're going to increase success, right? It's how are we allowing the right mix and everybody working together to allow DEI to thrive? And so I think that there's a lot of opportunities for companies, especially in the Twin Cities. You know, when you think about the Twin Cities, we're ranked everywhere almost as one of the best places to live in the country. But our ranking among diversity and equity and inclusion is lowest in the nation. And so I think that we need to make sure that we're playing our part locally as well as nationally. And so I think some of the easiest things that employers can do is to start to embrace empathy, to really embrace the listening and understanding of the employees, to really start to understand what your employees' backgrounds are. How are you going to allow that design of the organization for diverse individuals to thrive and succeed? So I'm a very big proponent about psychological safety, that we need to have employees be able to speak up and feel comfortable about speaking up. I can tell you, and this is for a lot of companies, I spent tens of thousands of hours speaking with employees, companies throughout my career. And what I can tell you is that companies say, hey, we embrace diversity. We want you to come here. But when you come there, you have to assimilate. So I think that what we need to do is to rethink of what we need to do for as employers to really embrace it. And to ask about others' cultures rather than telling you about our awesome culture. Because if I learn about your awesome culture and I look at your board, it's not that awesome for me. But then it also takes a little bit deeper of a dive into measurement and accountability. How are you measuring? You know, I think Kirk talked about measurement. I'm a very big proponent about measurement and data, and not around the passion. I think people have a lot of passion around DEI work. I know I do, but passion doesn't make it move. Data does. So I always try to lead with data. And then again, I think that it's important for companies to look at where are they in the DEI journey, right? Are they at the beginning, middle, or end? Are they just getting started? Do you want to focus on community advancement, retention? Do you want to focus on more of the equity hiring? Or what part of this journey do you really want us to focus on? Because it's a big body of work, and you need to be able to break it down and make differences.
Yeah,
speak with data. Go ahead, Virajita.
Sorry, I was going to just say that if I could pick up on a couple threads, one of the things that each one of you said was that it's really about shifting the norms, right? I mean, the norms as they have been defined over time have led us to where we are today. And it's really about, you know, breaking those. So even when Kelly talks about, you know, the two women connecting, it's like shifting what otherwise would keep happening in the room. And I'm just thinking that in our office, we have this motto, which is equity and diversity is everybody's everyday work, because we've recognized that it's not going to happen, you know, with somebody writing a policy or the Board of Regents kind of ruling, although that would be welcome, you know, we want that as well. But we want everyone wherever they are actually making something shift. And we all have spheres of influence. And I have to say, I've personally witnessed in the last year and a half after George Floyd's murder, our campus becoming just, you know, very, how should I say, everything sort of seemed to come apart at the seams because we were, you know, really challenged ourselves individually. Everyone was going through their own soul searching and reflection, but then our students, you know, they were saying, well, tell us what you've been doing all these years. Where's the hiring, you know, of our faculty and so on. And it was literally the shifting of the norms because departments had not been accustomed to students kind of connecting and mobilizing and asking these questions. And many of them were very, very respectful, but just asking the questions that needed to be asked. And that's then starting to shift norms. So I've just seen lots of changes happen in that sense. So I know that we have students in the audience, so don't underestimate your sphere of influence and also the ability to organize and connect, not only in this, you know, two people in a meeting room, but also as a larger group. because this is all for the good of our future, collective future
Right.
together. I also feel that leaders have an additional responsibility. So while we all have spheres of influence, I think somebody once said when I talked about this, that you sound like you're quoting Spider-Man or something, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. So
Yeah,
I just wanted
absolutely. Absolutely. And I love this whole idea around everybody's everyday work. And, you know, whatever the spirit of the sphere of influence is, we owe it to ourselves to make the most of it. So we're going to swing over to Virajita's comment about leaders. Before we do that, I'm going to go back to Kelly Baker, please. You know, you started us down this conversation around what individuals can do instinctively. And there is a lot of appetite for showing up as allies and for all of us to really lean into allyship. I would love for Kelly to help us really give us more examples of what that looks like on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Oh goodness. I think about this a lot. And obviously it's a huge topic of conversation among a lot of people. I think allyship is so important, and it's something all of us can take on, leaders, non-leaders. And I think it is one, leading with a ton of empathy and really understanding what empathy is, right? This idea of putting yourself in someone else's shoes, trying to understand through their shoes what their struggle is, what their issue is. I mean, that is, I think, key to being an ally. I think also key to being an ally is knowing that you have to do work for yourself, right? Being an ally isn't just, you know, saying, hey, what can I do to help, Kelly? It's like, okay, could you, like, being an ally is, hey, I've actually been doing a lot of reading, or I've observed this, or tell me more, Kelly, about being an experience of an African-American woman in corporate America, because I haven't seen a lot of you. And right. So it's understanding, doing enough of your own work and your own research to actually participate in a way that is not creating more drain or strain on whoever it is you're wanting to align with and be an ally for. I think that's a really important, in my mind, that's a really important aspect of being an ally is think about why, and then do your own work on how do you either educate yourself, really immerse yourself in the issue, use that as a point to then say, hey, I still don't know everything, but what I do know is that I want to help because I know enough to know that I can help here. The last thing I would say around this concept of allyship, and as I've reflected on, you know, I had an example, you know, gosh, this is probably 6-7 months ago, of a time where I was in a pretty heated conversation with a group of really senior people that were very dug into a particular point of view. There was one guy who clearly stepped into his role of an ally, who sensed the dynamic, who understood that there were dynamics that were beyond my control that were at play, but that were going to lead us down a path of a decision that wasn't in alignment with what we said we ultimately wanted. That was more focused, would have been a more inclusive end product. And he stepped up in his sphere of influence and said, listen, I actually don't know that we're thinking about this right. And he stepped into that spot to actually take on some of the burden that I was taking on with the team. And it was, to Virajina's point, we all have our sphere of influence, and we all need to step into that at times and actually stand up for those that are either marginalized, or those that are suffering, or those that are struggling, or those that are not being heard, or on and on and on. Find the courage to step up and step into that.
I can add to that too, Kelly. I love that so much. I think oftentimes it's not what you're hearing. It's oftentimes what you're seeing. And what I think is so important with that, and I'm picturing myself in a meeting a couple of years ago around a big room and looking over at this, you know, beautiful manager level person who was the only Latinx woman in the room. And somebody said something and she put her head down. And I was like, I saw that. And I immediately, when I left the room, pulled her aside and we had that from there had this beautiful, beautiful relationship of, I noticed what you did just there. Tell me about that. And, and then having, a female manager say at one point to me, like, when do I get to stop standing on a table to be heard? And that just breaks your heart. But at the same time, you're like, oh my gosh, like we have work to do. Let's get to work. Like, let's talk through that. Let's be in a position. Let's be each other's accountability buddy. One of my dear friends is actually dialed into this particular right now, and she's sending me, good job. Like, here's what you should think about. I like, you can't do it alone. I love what you said there. Yeah, that is such a powerful sentiment, as in, we can all step into it. And Sherry, if I may build on what you just said there, what you're calling us to do is to pay attention, to watch what people are saying, to watch people's reactions and reach out and step into it, like Kelly said. And related to that is to watch what's not being said and to watch whose voice is not being heard. And many of us are in Zoom rooms, team rooms, where someone is quiet, or, when the camera is off, you don't hear somebody chiming in. And it's on us to say, we haven't heard from Susan. We have not heard from Mary. And it's quite okay for us to take it upon ourselves to make sure that the table is set so that everybody can have an opinion. So
I want to just jump in here because I love what everybody's saying. And I actually have a personal experience behind this. I had a manager come up to me and said, Miguel, this isn't what you want your manager to say, okay? I know why you don't ask a lot of questions. And I'm just thinking, like, my heart drops. Like, I thought I asked a lot of questions, right? And unbeknownst to me, she took a course on how to manage Hispanic employees or how to talk to Hispanic employees. So she learned a lot, right?
Yeah.
And so she came in, she told me this. She's like, I know why you don't ask a lot of questions. I'm like, okay, tell me. She's like, when your mom asked you to take out the trash, what would you do? Take out the trash? If your mom asked you to clean up the room, what would you do? I'd clean up my room. Like, she's like, did you ever talk back to your parents? I'm like, no. Would you do what your parents told you to do? 100% yes. Because, I mean, there's a lot of aspects to the Hispanic culture I don't want to put all the way out there, but I'm going to listen to my parents. Like, I never spoke back to my parents. And I think that with regards to the Hispanic culture, we definitely it's in our culture to respect our elders. It's in our culture not to ask a lot of questions. Unbeknownst to me, it actually ended up affecting my career. After she mentioned that, she said, I'm going to start calling on you, Miguel. And I know you have a lot of ideas. I know you have a lot to say. And she started to do that. But then I also took it, again, we're talking about responsibilities of employees. I took it as my responsibility to start to read books, start to research myself on how to speak up, how to speak out. And this isn't so different from what I have learned from our Asian segment. About, again, speaking up and speaking out. And so there's a lot of opportunities that I learned that for myself that I can also bring out into other segments and to say, hey, you know what? There's some similarities there. But because my leader took that opportunity to do that, my career just skyrocketed. And it did. No doubt about it. Just because they took, wasn't an hour class or something to learn about me. I'm like, I didn't even know that about myself because that's how I live every day.
Right. There's such a powerful example of a leader who's done their work, educate themselves and learn how to unleash the power of their team. And there's somewhat of a parallel for Asian colleagues who sometimes exhibit that, deferential pattern of behaviors. Because there's a respect for authority figures, there is that respect for expertise. And it is important, for us to kind of name that and respect that, because at the end of the day, we're on the same team. We want to row the same boat in the same direction. Yet, and at the same time, we can make sure that those individuals are invited to provide input instead of waiting for a turn, which might not ever come. So really good call out. Let me piggyback off of these comments about what leaders are doing. You just shared some great examples of how leaders really step into their leadership, which is, far beyond setting goals and delegating tasks and measuring outcomes. And there's so much more that leaders can do around unleashing the power. And, whether it's inviting people to the dance floor or it's just a seat at the table, I think a lot of the conversation has been about bringing diversity into the mix. And I always love Kirk's mantra around if diversity is the mix, then inclusion actually makes the makes the magic of the mix work. So I'd love to have our panelists chime in. Maybe we'll start with Sherry around what can leaders do to create that environment. We've just heard a few really helpful examples. What are some other examples that we could all leverage?
Yeah, I think another, and again, I'll go to the tactical. To me, I think it's really important to have a diverse interview panel as much as it is to have diverse candidates. And oftentimes, and I love data. Miguel talked about data. Data is so important, and it becomes a blessing and a curse, as we all know. There's analysis paralysis, and there's also a lot of money tied up in getting to the data, which can also be, again, a wall and not a brick. So I think investments and budgets need to align with what kind of data you're looking for, and platforms that can provide that data is an extremely important investment. But as an individual, creating a space where you're not just going to hire the person that looks like you. I don't think people are even aware of it. I think it's an unconscious bias in a lot of cases where people will hire the person that either looks like or talks like or walks like or looks like them. And it is in some cases unconscious. So creating not only the interview panel, and I'm no longer with Best Buy, but what I love about so many things that they're doing, but one of the things that is very important to Corey Berry, as well as the entire executive team and everyone really at the company, is to make sure that you're bringing in not only a slate, but your interview panel is diverse, and not only just diverse by the way that we look, but by the way that we think and our backgrounds.
Right.
I do not want to lead a team of me. I don't want to just me. Like, that makes absolutely no sense. And there's no win-win out of that. So that's like a tactical thing I would provide.
Right. Wonderful. Great example. And also helping us to surface the importance of managing the bias that we all walk around, a whole bundle of biases, just like Miguel is explaining, the way we grew up, the way we're, taught when we're young, and the way that the culture, the organization is shaping us. So those biases can kind of run away and, allow us to make decisions without really thinking through. So having this diverse panel kind of is a mechanism to help you kind of challenge some of the assumptions that we tend to make. Any other examples of what leaders can do to unleash the power of their team?
Well, one of the things is, as usual, sorry.
No,
Go ahead.
I love listening more than talking.
Well, we want to hear what you say there. So hold the thought. Basically, I think modeling, right, about what they are doing. And I wanted to underscore, it's not modeling in maybe a traditional sense of leadership where I know what I'm thinking and I know what I want in this kind of maybe unrealistically confident way. It's modeling with humility, because we know there is the theory or the notion and the goal and the ideal of diversity and inclusion, and then there is the practice. And I think I'm sure we're going to address the questions at some point, and it's that in the cultural context we're in and the complexity of all of that, it's really tricky, right, to address this. But it doesn't mean that we don't do it. We do it, and be ready to apologize if we make a mistake, because we will make a mistake, as we navigate this. And that's the kind of leadership we want people to model. And then so that it's practical, we are seeing it in action, and that actually reassures people that something's happening much more than this fully formed perfect statement or action. that's somehow going to fix everything. So that's one thing I would recommend. And then the other is making sure we're kind of working in partnership, so that we're actually working. And I think Sherry mentioned that about job descriptions and so on. You can do it alone, but at the U, we're trying to empower committees to really reframe it, ask those questions, also constitute it. I mean, people talked about who's at the table. And so making sure that we have just diverse voices looking at those job descriptions and looking at the candidates and doing implicit bias training so that we're self-checking ourselves as well. Miguel.
Yeah. Miguel, were you going to add on? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add on, when thinking a lot about what are we doing to increase diversity at our companies, right? And then we start to think about what can our employees do, what can our leadership do, who are also the employees. We need to understand, and I think a lot of companies, what they're missing right now is understanding what Black fatigue is. I am not an expert in it, but what I do know is that, and I asked the question, why are we asking our Black and African American employees to partake in interviews, in speaking opportunities, engagement opportunities, when these employees, along with Hispanic and Latino, are not being promoted? They're not being paid. There's pay gaps, and we're not recruiting. And not only that, but we need to think about the outside influences about what all of the employees are going home to, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I don't go home and stop being Hispanic. It just doesn't happen to me. I mean, there's a lot of outside influences that we need to look at. But when I start to see our companies start to use our ERGs and BRGs as, hey, start to do all this work, go ahead and do it. Thank you. Where were you two or 3 years ago? And so for me, that's what I speak up against the most. And so how to combat that, right? So for everything I'm kind of talking about, it's really about, I came up with this concept called interview allies. And what interview allies are is opportunities to engage with not just African-American or Hispanic employees to partake in the interviews, because as Sherry said, like, we want diverse interview slate. But again, we're not doing a lot for these employees. So is it fair to ask? So interview allies is really training specific employees to be culturally competent in certain areas, to bring that unique voice to the interview table, which is extremely important. So I agree with Sherry, you need to have a lot of diversity. If it's diversity of thought, whatever you need to do, you need to build up the cultural competency of at least one person. It should be all, in an ideal where it should be every single person. But you need to have somebody to have that diverse lens, and then need to go through significant L&D training and to find out where they are in that training. So that's just that's my thoughts. I definitely agree with what she's saying and how we
important call out. And there is training, and there's certainly more mechanisms to use to kind of surface some tendencies and biases and challenge the assumptions. I think what we're talking about here is also pointing to the importance of the broader context in which we are operating, whether it's the organization, policies, and culture, whether it's like the local market culture. There's a question around, in the Midwest environment, there tends to be a bit more, shall we say, conflict averse or passive aggressive tendencies. And then, certainly, there are historical records around bias and discrimination. So to what extent can organizations, whether it's the university or any institution, we have so much opportunity to help shape this environment for diverse talent, and all of us to benefit from the richness of diverse groups. So maybe, Kelly, I could start with you, and I'd love for all the panelists to chime in around how do we shape, whether it's the policies or the systems or the practices how do we shape an organizational environment for this to flourish?
Yeah, I do think, I appreciate the question. I've got echo on my end. Are you guys okay?
Yeah, you're clear.
Okay. I appreciate the question because I do think that, I grew up in the Midwest. I've been in the Midwest most of my life. But I do think particularly in this community, we do face some particular challenges. And Miguel alluded to those earlier, where we've got, we're kind of known for being really progressive and very left-leaning in some circumstances, but also very committed to our communities, et cetera. Yet we've got the greatest achievement gaps. I see it every single day. And then I feel like, and certainly I've seen this play out over the kind of George Floyd to now, where we almost have an inflated view of how progressive we actually are, when we haven't really dealt with, kind of at the core of what needs to be addressed. So I think about our community in particular, that, we have, and I think many of us know this, we have a pretty embedded and deep history of just kind of institutional racism in our communities. And so taking time to like really understand the history there, and then taking time to think through, okay, given that, and now we look at how the kind of the makeup of our communities and how that plays out. Now, how can we take a look at what programs, initiatives, focus, et cetera, can help us try to combat that? But I do think you have to come in very realistic on where you are, and where I see sometimes leaders, both corporate leaders, community leaders, et cetera, sometimes misfire is when we kind of believe the hype of how progressive and awesome we are. And then we don't actually recognize that a lot of that is high, because underneath all of that is there's some real issues that, as we've seen, certainly over the last year and a half, that we really need to reconcile and to really come to grips with in order to actually decrease disparities in our community. I've been part of a awesome community of corporate leaders in town, and we're very much trying to focus on how do we build more diverse pipelines to feed all of our organizations, not just corporations, but our higher universities, et cetera. Our pipelines don't feel as diverse. And one thing we've talked a ton about is, well, if we look in our communities, we actually see diversity there, but what we don't see clear enough is that pipeline from the communities that we see that are increasingly diverse to the universities in our communities, to then the company and opportunities in our communities. And so it's almost like we've got a really rich, very, pipeline, but there's something going on between that pipeline and then opportunities that many of us have been made available to many of us. How do we really understand that and attack that? And I think certainly as leaders in this community, it absolutely is, I think, our obligation to lean into those and to try to help figure out how can we break down one at a time many of those barriers.
Yeah, such powerful perspective there. It really makes me think back to Miguel's comment earlier in our conversation around speak with data, because we do have such good intentions, and sometimes it is a tendency for us to believe that our positive intentions have that impact, and we need to face the data and face the reality as well. All right. So we've had a lot of conversations, and by the way, there's a question in the Q&A queue as well around, what companies can do, organizations can do in terms of creating this environment, as well as addressing inequities where we find them, whether it's pay inequity or opportunity access. Sherry talked about, are you posting your positions? Do you really give everyone an opportunity to actually access those opportunities? So even with the most diverse and inclusive environment, if people can't quite get to the opportunities, then they can't grow with us. So really meaningful question there. I'm going to wrap up this conversation today. Obviously, as you can tell, the energy is powerful here, and there's so much expertise and so much experience. We can go on for quite some time. In the interest of time, let me just close the conversation around, we've talked a lot about the ambitions are huge, and the business case and the moral case is very strong. And yet, what would it take for us to actually drive meaningful impact? There's a sentiment around, building one brick at a time. There's a sentiment around showing up as an ally. And I love Kirk's comment here around even showing up with humility by asking, what am I missing, allows others to come forward with their different perspectives. And there is this sense of ownership that each one of us should be doing everybody's everyday work. And it is that sense of owning that space, stepping into it, observing the impact on each other and holding each other up and amplify each other's impact. So there are some specific things that we can all learn from this conversation. So then in closing, let me ask each panelist, we'll start with Sherry and we'll swing over to Miguel and Kelly and Virajita to give us a sense of what makes you optimistic. The challenges are daunting. And yet, just in the few minutes that we have together, we have some really meaningful actions that we can all take. So what gives you a reason to be optimistic that we can indeed drive to a much meaningful progress to the point of making all of us proud to have been part of this journey? We'll start with Sherry.
Thank you so much, Roz. And I actually just have a quick little story, and this sums it up perfectly for me. We had a position opening within the last year at Best Buy, and an applicant asked to speak to the leaders of the Black Employee Resource Group and the Women's Employee Resource Group. And I happen to be leading as the executive sponsor of the Women's Employee Resource Group for 5 years. It's the thing I'm the most proud of. And she wanted to talk to me. She had so many questions for me. I was so floored and so moved by that, because one, no one had ever done that before. No one had ever taken the time it was extremely important to her. And she was going to make a life decision to go to an organization based on my answer. So no pressure. She did end up taking the job. So I feel really good about that. But if I didn't feel that we were making progress in that area, I couldn't have told her otherwise. And so the fact that it means that much really inspired me. And as I'm in the job market now, I'm asking that too. I want to see the stats. I'm actually not interested in talking unless I know what your plans are. Do you have a DEI council? Do you have a leader? Do you have employee resource groups? Talk to me about them. I want the names of some people within your organization that I can talk to. I don't want the leaders. I want the people. So I think, for me, that just sums it up. I think the conversation's changing. I loved what Ambreen said about, I am very optimistic because I think there's more conversation and this is happening.
Wonderful. Thank you. Miguel, what gives you a sense of optimism that we can make meaningful progress?
You know what? I'm gonna have to give a good answer on this, right? Okay, because I am optimistic. I have had numerous opportunities within the last year to join as a leader for DEI, not just in Minnesota, but throughout the United States. That gives me a lot of optimism. The things that I'm seeing in the community are still happening. It's still there. It's still real for me. I haven't been in this industry, 10 plus years, right? I've been in it long enough to see where companies will make this investment, all companies, and then it kind of shies away a little bit. So I am optimistic that things have changed. Companies are saying the right things. Everybody's doing the right things. What I would like to see is this continued, not only optimism, but success, this continued trajectory to keep going. I'm reading reports that LinkedIn has already seen a steady drop off since George Floyd of DEI positions. So that's a little concerning. But what I start to see is that these conversations are happening. Tyrick created this conversation. So I'm very, very thankful. I am now the co-chair of the Carlson 360 group, which is the Carlson Color of Alumni. So all these different programmings and opportunities, it is giving me so much hope. I'm just a little cautious because I want to see it continue. And just to go back one more time is that my mother in 1985, she was one of 4 principals selected in St. Paul schools. She was the Hispanic principal, that an African American, that a Native American, that an Asian principals, and they were all to take up their specific segments. And that was Word for Hope. And she fought and fought, and she's done a wonderful job. We need to continue that fight. So optimism for me is that this conversation's happening. Everybody who is in this conversation is involved. We're seeing record numbers of HBCU giving throughout the United States. So I love seeing all this action. I'm just I want it to keep continuing.
Yeah. Well, your energy and your certainly your stories are so inspiring. So keep it up. Virajita, yeah, thank you. Virajita, can I swing it over to you?
Sure. So I have, I'm just in a different space because I just got back as part of the University of Minnesota delegation to the COP26 climate change conference last week. And one of the things that struck me, the exciting thing that for all of us is that equity and inclusion was on every session. Like it was mentioned, but we're talking about global equity. But meanwhile, there was, I think in the 2 weeks, there were expected to be 25,000 people from 200 countries. And people from all walks of life, from the press to business people, to government officials, to youth activists, to indigenous peoples, and so on. And I just came back thinking that diversity is the true way of life. And so when we find a struggle to kind of enact that diversity or convince people, that's actually because we have socialized ourselves into believing an alternative version of reality than it truly is. And so what makes me optimistic is that somehow these curtains on our minds, or what cobwebs or whatever you call it, will somehow be released. It's just a matter of time, because in fact, it's essential that we all work together to save the planet, as well as without that equity issues being discussed, we are not going to do it anyway. So I think it's just like this imperative. And I think it's a matter of time. It's not going to be easy. It'll be quite messy. But I think we're going to get to a place where we look back and say that, oh, remember the time?
Yeah. What an amazing inspirational moment for you to bring that energy back to us from a global perspective. Thank you for that. Kelly.
I'll be quick. There are lots of things that give me hope. But the one that I saw just recently, Spencer Stewart came out with they do a kind of an annual study on boards of directors, and their latest study showed a significant increase. I was just pulling it up actually. 47% of new directors named over the course of the last year for 2021 were people of color. That's up from 22% in 2020. And what makes me, so that's awesome in and of itself. But what is more awesome about that is that decision, even if kind of the attention falls off a little bit or dissipates a little bit, what we've done and what's been done over the last year has seated people of color in particular in positions of influence and power that cannot be shaken or taken away very easily, right? So you think about, literally we use this example of in the boardroom, change can happen in the boardroom, but we're changing the makeup of the boardroom. And I would argue that over the course of the last year, we've made a huge step forward. And that gives me a ton of hope that we'll start to see that trickling down into the organizations, certainly across the United States. So that's a more durable and sustainable set of actions than others that we've seen over the course of the last year.
Wow, that's fantastic progress. And, you know, to our earlier point, the data speaks an important moment of progress. So with that, I want to thank our distinguished panelists for taking the time to share your energy, your passion, your experiences, your practical ideas for how each of us can take action. And you inspire us to believe that this journey is powerful and meaningful. And in the words of the former Secretary of State Colin Powell, you know, the idea that belief is a force multiplier. And, you know, to take that perspective and take on Miguel's point about passion plus data plus, you know, personal action, and we can propel progress with everyone around us in the communities where we live and work. So with that, Tariq and Allison, thank you for making this event possible. Kirk, thank you for your role model and your legacy. And thank you all panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, my thanks to you, Roz, and to Kelly and Sherry and Rajda and Miguel. What a phenomenal panel. You know, this recording is going to be required viewing for classes in the Technological Leadership Institute for years to come. So I'm just the depth of discussion and insight that you all had. Really, it's heartwarming and awesome to see. So thank you so much. So last few couple of minutes, let me just take some time and just go through some closing remarks. First of all, it was just great also to have Professor Frogat participate and give out the first Kirk Frogat Diversity and Inclusion Fellowship Award, and congratulations to our recipient, Ambreen Nathar. Just wanted to remind you of that. We have a fund established for Professor Frogat. We are welcoming contributions to that in order to have a permanent endowment. So your contributions are certainly welcome. I also wanted to point out that there's more resources available. Those of you who are interested in learning more and digging deeper into this issue, which I hope many of you are, in particular, the Office for Equity and Diversity at the University of Minnesota, which is where Vrajda Singh comes from, has a really good website and many resources there. Some of these resources are for, as you can see from the URLs, affinity groups within the University of Minnesota for students as well as faculty and staff. But then there are also broader resources for the community as a whole in the Twin Cities, and in fact for the state at large as well. We will be putting a video of this event available on the TLI website. We also will be producing a summary of the panel session as well. And I was making notes as all the discussions were going on. I think there's a lot to capture in a document. So Roz, I hope you and I can work together on that, and we can involve the other panelists as well. Please sign up for the TLI newsletter to receive any updates. You can just send a note to me. My email address is on the slide. It'll be on the last slide too. And we'll put you on the mailing list. And then just a final word about the Technological Leadership Institute. As you heard earlier, we have 3 Masters of Science programs, one in the Management of Technology, which is the one that I lead, one in Medical Device Innovation, one in Security Technologies. We think of all of these as really managerial and leadership programs oriented towards current and future technology leaders. And so if you're interested in that topic, and of course, you know, we cover diversity and equity issues in our curriculum as well, of course, in addition to a lot of other content too, please go visit our website as listed here for more information. And we're currently taking applications for our programs for next year. So it would be great to have some of you in the audience sign up for an information session or contact us for more information. And finally, a thank you to our panelists once again, to Roz as the moderator, and to Kirk Frogat and to Ambreen Nathar for participating, and to all of you in the audience who were able to take advantage of all the wealth of learning and insight that was on offer today. So with that, thank you all again very much, and Have a good rest of the evening. Bye-bye.